My name is Margot Wren. I am 31 years old, and 2 years ago I died. Or rather, I almost did, but for one long night the doctors in white coats assumed I wouldn't survive. They gathered just outside my ICU door, murmuring in clinical tones about intracranial pressure and skull fractures. Hospital machines beeped steadily, tubes snaking around my arms. My face was puffy and completely unrecognizable. My brain had suffered trauma, but I was still present, wordless, imprisoned, paying attention. Someone reached out to my emergency contacts. Walter and Vivian Granger showed up after 1 a.m. I wasn't able to see them. Obviously, I couldn't move, yet I could hear everything. I listened as my mother's heels clattered too quickly on the floor tiles. I caught my father, Walter, asking the neurologist, "How much is this all going to cost?" A lengthy silence followed. The physician, Dr. Lila Kim, as I would discover later, responded with caution. "We need approval to proceed with surgery. There's a high likelihood of further brain trauma if left untreated. Are you her legal guardians?" My mother, Vivian Granger, let her voice slide into a lower register. "That's not straightforward. She's not our biological child," she said. My father, Walter Granger, added, "The legal documents were never really completed." But that wasn't true. My adoption had been fully official for more than 20 years. Dr. Lila Kim paused, but she had both of my adoptive parents listed as emergency contacts. "She isn't our duty," Vivian commented, her tone cold and unyielding. "For years we did all that was possible, but we have no obligation to her anymore." It was right then that I realized I wouldn't let myself die. Not because of treatments, not because of miracles, but because I refused to accept that as my conclusion. Several hours afterwards, Celeste Roy phoned Sloane Reeves, my co-founder, best friend, and closest equivalent to a sister I had. Sloane acted immediately. She flew out from Seattle, completed the paperwork, and advocated tirelessly for each intervention. She remained at my bedside to ensure I never felt alone. She made certain there was always someone with me. By the end of that week, I no longer needed the ventilator to breathe on my own. My neurological condition had stabilized. I wasn't fully awake, but I was present, still alive in that hospital bed. The Grangers did not return, though they turned up at my grandmother, Agnes Fairchild's, house the next Monday. I later saw the video of that encounter. Walter paced nervously on the porch, while Vivian fiddled with her pearl necklace, her impatience clear as she waited for the locksmith. Juliet, my adoptive sister, lingered in stiff silence at the back, her face impossible to read. Their purpose was to retrieve what Agnes had entrusted to me, but the entry remained closed to them. There was no furniture, no family treasures, no sets of keys for them to discover. Only a solitary envelope rested on the dining table, waiting for me. That envelope contained a message that would unravel all their carefully guarded secrets. We used to live in a white colonial house on a peaceful street in Bend. It was the sort of home with hydrangeas by the door and shutters that lined up in perfect symmetry, matching the mailbox. Outwardly, we appeared to be the sort of family who mailed out holiday cards dressed in coordinated clothing. And indeed, we did. Walter and Vivian Granger, my parents, were considered pillars within the local community. My father, Walter, sported four-piece suits even on Saturdays, and his laughter would ring out at every fundraising gala. My mother, Vivian, put together garden parties and delivered compliments that often sounded more like subtle criticisms. Then there was Juliet Granger, dazzling and utterly irresistible. Even when Juliet, my sister, threw a tantrum, it seemed more like a display of passion than a fit. I tended to keep to myself, dutifully following the rules, organizing my folders by color, and remembering to say please without needing to be prompted. In all our school pictures, Juliet's head would tilt with a sort of bold ownership of the space. Mine was usually just off-center with a careful, reserved smile. Juliet always ended up with the larger bedroom. She was given the last cookie. She claimed the window seat on every family trip. Any artwork I made was quietly tucked away in drawers. Her artwork remained on display on the fridge with pride until the adhesive no longer held. One time, I questioned why my mother always chose the Thai place for our Friday night dinners. "Your sister Juliet needs more affirmation," Walter had explained. "You do not." When I emerged victorious at the regional spelling bee back in 6th grade, my mother Vivian hardly glanced up from her cup of tea. "Well, of course," she murmured. "You always seem to excel." I once believed that meant I was their chosen one. I thought being dependable, predictable, and competent would mean I was cherished. But love isn't supposed to feel like a performance. I finally understood the reality when I was 12. It was after 1 a.m., and I had snuck downstairs to get a drink of water. From the kitchen came their voices, harsh and on edge. "You've always had a soft spot for Juliet," my mother Vivian snapped. "It's as if I'm trying to compensate for the fact that I'm not actually theirs." "She isn't yours either, Vivian," my father Walter shot back. "We made a promise that we would never treat her differently." The glass tumbled from my grip and shattered across the tiles. There was a moment of stillness, then the sound of approaching footsteps. I bolted to my bedroom and hid beneath the sheets just before my mother walked in. She stood silently in the doorway for a few seconds, then left without saying a thing. The next morning, I listlessly stirred my bowl of cereal, waiting. "I heard you last night," I told them. Walter Granger kept his gaze on the newspaper in front of him. Vivian helped herself to some coffee. "I know I'm adopted." An uncomfortable pause followed. Vivian put on that flawless, taut smile that always stopped short of her eyes. "Don't be absurd, Margot. That must have been a dream." And that was the end of it. No one confirmed and no one denied. Just the usual evasion at breakfast. That became the day I understood that, in my family, appearances mattered more than honesty. From then on, I pushed myself even further, striving for perfection, determined to be needed, and desperate to earn what I believed should have been mine by right. Because if I couldn't be accepted for who I truly was, perhaps I could remain valued for what I accomplished. After that evening in the kitchen, I fixated on achievement. Not just strong grades, flawless ones. Not merely awards, but regional titles. I didn't just hope my parents would pay attention. I needed them to see me and recognize something they couldn't ignore. I finished high school as valedictorian and delivered the commencement address in a sharp navy blazer my mother chose but never admired. I was accepted to Pacific Technical Institute on a full scholarship. When I phoned home, my mother remarked, "Well, you always were efficient." At commencement, my parents attended. My father applauded precisely 3 times during my speech. My mother kept her sunglasses on for the whole event, even inside the auditorium. Together they smiled for pictures, shook hands with my instructors, and departed early for a dinner with my sister Juliet. None of it made a difference. I was creating something far greater than their permission. At 25, I launched a health tech startup alongside Sloan Reeves, my closest friend from my undergraduate days. Together, we developed a diagnostic program that identifies uncommon diseases through voice analysis and tracking eye movement. It was fast, user-friendly, and imbued with warmth. The business flourished. We appeared on investor panels and were featured in Ignite Business Review. My parents were present at our inaugural gala. My father, Walter Granger, raised his glass and spoke about bringing up daughters who take charge. My mother, Vivian Granger, was draped in her pearls and insisted on calling me Margot Wren throughout the evening, as if I were a perfect resume in motion. Only one person ever recognized there was more to me than my achievements. My grandmother, Agnes Fairchild, resided in Eugene in a rickety old Victorian surrounded by stacks of books and the comforting scent of cinnamon. After being widowed at a young age, she brought up Walter with a strong will softened by kind eyes. When I found out about the adoption in middle school, she started inviting me to spend summers with her and offered the acceptance I couldn't find anywhere else. "You read like your mother," she once remarked, as she handed me an old worn copy of Jane Eyre, was always lost in her own world, but remarkably intelligent. Curious, I asked who my mother actually was. She hesitated for a moment, then answered, "Someone who cared for you deeply, but wasn't prepared. I'll tell you everything one day." That promised day seemed to slip further away each time. Then Harvest Day arrived. 4 years ago, everyone gathered together. Me, Juliet Granger, Walter Granger, Vivian Granger, and Agnes Fairchild, who had become more frail, but was as keen as ever. Eventually, our discussion shifted to my startup's Series A funding round. Agnes grinned with pride. "I always knew I would accomplish something remarkable. I've always wanted to demonstrate my abilities," Vivian commented as she took a sip of wine. I fixed my eyes on her. "Is that really what you think has motivated me?" "Isn't it true?" Walter asked. "It's pretty typical for adopted kids to go through an overachievement phase." Juliet let go of her fork, letting it clatter onto the table. I placed my napkin on my lap. "You refused to admit it for so many years." "We believed keeping the truth from you would be best," my mother said, her attention shifting to the cranberry sauce. Agnes slammed her palm against the table. "That's enough, Vivian." But it still wasn't. I got to my feet, my voice unsteady. "You never actually wanted me. You wished for a daughter who made you look impressive, not one who needed your support." After that, I walked out. I didn't make any phone calls. I ignored every message. I even changed my phone number. Agnes was the only person I continued seeing each Saturday, every single week. She was the last place that still felt like home to me. The night everything changed, it was raining. It was that gentle, steady rain that turned well-worn roads into shimmering glass. I lingered at the office longer than I should have. We were getting ready for a significant update, and I couldn't bring myself to leave it incomplete. Sloane told me to head home by 8 o'clock, but I chose not to heed that advice. Just 15 minutes from my apartment, a car ran the light at Holston in Idaho. What they told me later was that it struck the driver's side at 53 mph an hour. I can't recall any noise, just the quiet afterward, the type that vibrates like a constant dial tone in my mind. I learned later that the paramedics had needed to extricate me from the smashed car, that my ribs were broken, my collarbone was in pieces, and there was both bleeding in my brain and pressure behind my eyes. By the time I arrived at the ER, I was already unconscious, and that's where I remained, still, intubated, and alone. At 3:43 a.m., the hospital reached out to the emergency contacts listed in my phone, Walter and Vivian Granger. They showed up. They saw me, unmoving, dressed in blood and hooked up to machines. And then they departed. "She's not really our daughter," Walter Granger explained to the attending doctor. "Nothing official. The adoption wasn't finalized." "This isn't our obligation," my mother added. "We're not able to authorize anything." They never inquired whether I was hurting. They didn't inquire about what I required. Their questions focused on the expenses involved. The surgery was halted until permission could be given. That was when Celeste Roy intervened, reaching out to Sloane Reeves. Sloane arrived an hour later, drenched and wide-eyed, and completed the consent paperwork. She got in touch with our business's attorney. She sat at my bedside and read from our work proposals as if I were still attending meetings with her. Celeste Roy monitored my vital signs and murmured reports to me at every shift transition. She played songs she thought would suit my taste. She assured me, "You're not alone," even though, in truth, I was. By law, I carried the Granger name. That evening, however, my adoptive parents told the hospital otherwise. They chose the lie that let them walk away. I might have lost my life to that deception if not for Sloane Reeves, Celeste Roy, and the kind of chosen family I built for myself. Regaining consciousness felt like being hauled over shards of glass. My throat felt raw from the breathing tube. My arms and legs wouldn't obey me at all. The ache in my head pulsed in unpredictable surges I couldn't prepare for. Every part of me screamed with pain. But somehow I had survived. Sloane Reeves was beside me when I finally managed to open my eyes. Celeste Roy was there too, holding a warm cloth and murmuring softly, "Hey, you made it." Speaking was impossible for me, but I managed a single blink. That one gesture was all they needed. Both Sloane Reeves and Celeste stayed by my side. Recovering went at a glacial pace. For several days, I couldn't even sit up without getting sick. Even blinking too quickly would set the whole room spinning. Yet I forced myself to continue, because a part of me hidden beneath the bruises and fractured bones still remembered. Memories surfaced of my adoptive parents leaving me behind. After I'd spent a week in a quieter wing, Sloane broke the news that Agnes Fairchild had quietly passed away in her sleep 8 months earlier. That was something I hadn't known. Vivian and Walter had failed to mention it to me. What I did receive, however, was a letter sent by Mr. Whitaker, Agnes's lawyer. He showed up in person, dressed in a charcoal suit and speaking gently. I arrived carrying a sealed envelope alongside a slender packet of legal papers. "I told you. My grandmother had entrusted me with the task of handing these to you directly, in case she was unable to tell you the truth herself." Within that envelope, I found a letter penned in Agnes Fairchild's handwriting. She laid out all the details for me. According to her, my biological mother was her niece, Alice Rowan, who became pregnant at just 21. The man involved had vanished from their lives. Agnes stepped in, offering the option of an adoption within her own family. Her son, Walter Granger, and his wife, Vivian Granger, had been dealing with infertility for some time. It all felt somehow destined. However, Agnes hadn't anticipated that Vivian would conceive Juliet less than 2 months after bringing me into their home. Suddenly there were 2 babies, one biologically theirs, and one not. I observed the emotional gap between our families widening as time passed. I raised my concerns with Walter repeatedly. Walter continually assured me that he would improve, but nothing ever really changed between us. The entire adoption process had been legitimate. Every document had been submitted, every paper signed. I officially belonged to them, both in name and under the law. Walter and Vivian Granger were aware. But comprehension and true acceptance do not always come together. Mr. Whitaker pushed another envelope my way across the tray table. He explained that they had requested emergency conservatorship. According to him, their argument was that I wasn't mentally capable of handling Agnes Fairchild's estate. I fixated on the name at the top of the petition, Margot Wren, respondent. They had abandoned me to my fate, and now they sought after what Agnes Fairchild had bestowed to me. It wasn't affection that motivated them. It was power. However, they were unaware of the letter or my intentions regarding it. My recovery progressed at a rate that surprised everyone. The pain remained, but it no longer controlled me. My pace was slow, my arm still immobilized in a sling, but I was fueled by something more than physical healing. The truth. The house belonging to Agnes Fairchild awaited. Although probate wasn't finished on my house, I was granted entry. Mr. Whitaker made that possible. I hired a security company to replace the locks and set up cameras in each room. "You'll have access to watch everything from anywhere," the installer assured me. That was exactly my intention. After that, I wrote the letter. It took me 3 attempts before I was satisfied with it. My first draft was filled with frustration. The second version felt overly detached. By the third draft, I found what I needed. Something that declared the truth, not a battle. Feeling their guilt wasn't what I wanted. Instead, I hoped they would recognize their own actions reflected back at them, impossible to ignore. I attached copies of the hospital documentation solidifying my adoption's legality. Within my grandmother Agnes Fairchild's letter, I added an extra sentence. The cameras are running. When the Grangers showed up, I watched remotely from Sloane Reeves's place. Exactly at 7:13 p.m., Vivian Granger's vehicle came up the drive. Walter Granger was the first to get out, checking the time. My sister hesitated as she followed me, her gaze sweeping the porch as if she suspected something wasn't quite right. We tried entering through the main door, found it locked, contacted a locksmith, signed a waiver, and entered as though it were our own place. Walter Granger headed to the second floor. My mother made a direct line for the cabinet where the fine dishes were kept. My sister froze in the corridor until her eyes found the envelope that sat on the dining table. My mother picked it up and opened it. As my adoptive mother went through the contents, her complexion went pale. Walter came down carrying a vase, glanced at the documents, and flushed angrily. Juliet read along over my adoptive mother's shoulder. Her face didn't change. It simply collapsed in on itself. I watched the entire scene unfold before me. No words, only motion. When the act faltered in that instant, I realized that the truth doesn't have to shout to be understood. The message arrived 4 days after the letter was opened. Juliet, can we have a conversation? Just the two of us. I didn't know Margot Wren. I promise I truly didn't know. I looked at the message for a long while before I typed a reply. Tomorrow, 9:30 a.m. at Maple Row Coffee House. I was already waiting by the time Sloane Reeves arrived, seated at a table in the corner with 2 coffees set before me. I stood as soon as I spotted Sloane, then immediately sat back down, feeling a bit uneasy. It had been 4 years since either of us had said a word to the other. You still drink it black with just a single sugar, she remarked, sliding a mug toward me. I do. I took a drink and stayed quiet. I don't even know how to begin, she confessed. I believed what they told me at the hospital. I can't believe that's true, but I did. I know. I saw the video and the note. She hesitated, eyes lowered. I guess some part of me always sensed something was off, but I refused to acknowledge it. I kept telling myself you were simply more independent, or that they treated you more strictly since you were older, or... I let the silence linger between us. This time she didn't try to interrupt it. I'm sorry. I finally expressed my regrets. For not raising questions, for holding my tongue when I most needed words. To them, I was the one who brought pride. That was a status I was desperate to keep. I gave a slow, understanding nod. Just small steps at a time, Juliet, I told her. That was the most I could promise at the moment. I'll take what I can get, she responded. 3 weeks later, she relocated to my grandmother's eastern wing. She said the arrangement was only temporary. I didn't ask her how long she planned to stay. The Grangers made one last, desperate attempt and filed a lawsuit for emotional anguish. They claimed that the letter and video had damaged their reputation and destroyed their acceptance in the community. The matter went before a judge, but the judge dismissed it with prejudice, calling it an attempt to suppress proven facts. Local reporters picked up on the situation. Old associates from work, members at the country club, and people who lived nearby all became curious. None of their faces appeared in the regional newspaper after that. Their names disappeared from charity lists. In the end, they left for Arizona. There was no farewell, no admission of guilt. But by then, I realized I'd stopped hoping for either. Juliet brought over dinner the night the verdict was announced, choosing takeout from the Thai place that Agnes Fairchild used to enjoy. She placed the food on the counter, glanced at the unopened stack of legal papers, and offered me a small smile. "Congratulations," she told me, "for asking for this, for it finally being over with the Grangers." I considered the vacant areas in my thoughts, once filled by the Grangers, and understood she was correct. The constant turmoil had finally faded. 18 months later, the dining room was lit with the same comforting golden glow I remembered from my younger days, filled with gentle conversations and the soft sounds of silverware. The table was crowded again, only now with the people who had been there when everything truly mattered, not just those I was connected to by obligation or family. Sloane Reeves sat across from me, laughing as she swirled her wine, retelling a memory from the earliest days of Vocal Bridge when we almost lost our very first customer because I refused to let a mistake remain in the proposal. Celeste stifled a laugh and handed me the bread basket. "Even in a coma, you were more organized than most of this hospital," she remarked. Juliet smiled from the opposite end of the table, more subdued than usual, but steady as ever. She had settled into her own pace working in the East Wing. The process hadn't always been simple. I continued to stub my toes on my old routines, though the groundwork between us felt changed, sincere and deliberate. Mr. Whitaker was present as well, positioned near the fireplace. Surveying the room, I said, "Agnes would have been fond of this, especially being surrounded by everyone." The house had been renovated, with new plumbing, a fresh coat of paint, and a recently replaced roof, yet I preserved the original trim, the squeaky floorboards, and the lavender wallpaper in Agnes's reading nook. I needed it to reflect her. Nostalgia, untouched by grief. On the upper floor, my office was no longer crowded with early startup inventions. Now it stored drawings and ideas for a fresh initiative, Vocal Bridge, a tool designed for patients with brain injuries who were unable to vocalize but remained conscious. Sloane and I were experimenting with eye movement tracking and brainwave readings, anything that might allow physicians to detect a person's inner presence. I distinctly remember telling Sloane once that I was still present. I simply wasn't able to convince anyone of it. Perhaps now our work could help another person be acknowledged. As the evening pressed on, those minutes felt effortless. There was nothing to prove, just a sense of togetherness. Juliet pitched in to help me collect the dishes. Celeste hung around to assist with packing up the remaining food. Mr. Whitaker left with a friendly wave, assuring us he'd be back each Saturday. Sloane embraced me in her usual way, fierce and full of reassurance. Later on, after the household had quieted, I walked out onto the porch. Fireflies floated slowly over the lawn, just as they always had when I was a little girl nestled next to Agnes on the swing. "Is there space for another?" Juliet asked from behind. I nodded, and she joined me on the swing. Neither of us said a word.